Let's see if we can get this share screen here going. Can you see it? Are we up?
Yes, you are up.
Yes.
Okay, and now I've got a slideshow. Concurrent slide. Oh, let's see. Seems to be coming. Time is on its own here. Okay.
Yes, it's
Does everybody see it?
yes, it's working.
Okay, so I'm missing the top of it here. I don't know if there's a way to get it shorter, but let's see if this works for now. It's not moving. Oh, there we go. Okay, but it is there a way to make it a little smaller?
I don't think so. Just can you?
Okay, so anyway, this is the overview, and this was a much bigger project than I anticipated. So I'm going to do the first part of this with Gebser's truth, awareing in truth. And so these are the guiding principles, kind of. The artist is the antenna of the race. For Gebser, these artists are manifestations of the structures of consciousness, the mutations that go forward. Surrealism is destructive, but it destroys only what it considers to be shackles of our vision. And that was Salvador Dali. And this is one of the mysteries that I'm not going to totally deal with today of how do we shift? How do we drop the shackles of one structure and move to another? And finally, men make their own history, but they do not make it as they please. They do not make it under self-selected circumstances, but under circumstances existing already. And this is the notion, there are institutions, that there are things that persevere, like a Supreme Court ruling, right? So the funny thing is that we think there are institutions and sometimes there aren't. I wish I could get this a little smaller. It doesn't, I'm not seeing the edges here. Anybody's suggestions? Can't. Okay.
It looks really good from here.
Yeah, but I can't see the right part of it. Let's see.
Do you have people blocking it? You shouldn't. All right.
No, I'll tell you what, I'm going to put myself up in the corner here. Now I can see everything.
That's right.
Okay, so we begin some definitions. For the Greeks, it's about perception of the senses, perceptions of things like art or life, things that are perceptible, to perceive by the senses or the mind, to feel, and generally to perceive. And I'm going to tie this into Merleau-Ponty, whose major movement as philosopher is about receptivity and the perceptive. The word aesthetic in the Latin was first used by Baumgarten in 1750 to designate the science of sensuous knowledge, whose goal is beauty in contrast with logic, and whose goal is truth. This is just one version, especially of logic and truth, and I think you can see where this is already shifting to deficient rational, the duality. Kant, we'll get to, seems to introduce the demand that aesthetics be determined by reason judgment, rather than the intuition of the perceptual faculties. However, he also opens the door, the magic for me comes from that door to intuition as opposed to reason. So Plato, we'll go right back. I read all of the classics and picked a few things out. Plato's aesthetic is the beautiful. And the beautiful, in the Symposium, we find a statement such as, beauty in every form is one and the same. So, but that's kind of a trick statement there, because beauty was a Platonic ideal for sure. However, a scan of the 2-volume collection of Plato's work gives references to beauty, a slippery thing, Lysias, and the gradations of beauty in the Symposium. So it's not so straightforward. It's not something we can all agree on. Aesthetics then develops along several paths, including the good, the true, and the virtuous. And we'll come back to that. Well, right now, actually. Tragedy finds us where reasons end. The life lived badly leads to hubris, anger, and heedlessness. This was an article I read recently in the New York Times about Greek tragedy. And if you violate the norms of beauty, the tragedy is really severe. And if you know anything about Greek tragedy, you might be eaten by the Titans or whatever. Zeus might have to revive you. So the life lived bad is hubris, anger, heedlessness. These things, like heedlessness, could lead to a climate crisis. Oops. And this to me is the height of the mental before it degrades. And just look at the skeptical look there. We're entering a new era. So Kant, at its most salient, taste is a preconceptualization. Kant talks about intuition, and the general term that's being used by then is taste, is kind of predominating. But it's the intuition, and Kant says there's a judgment there, but the main thing is it's preconceptual. It's pure intuition, a feeling of internal sense, a judgment, pre-science and practical concerns before reflection. The key to the aesthetic realm lies, therefore, in a certain disinterested attitude. And that's Kant. That's this sense that in the rational consciousness, we can be disinterested, which we may assume toward any object, such as an artwork, which can be expressed in many contrasting ways. Reason is the way, Kant argues, and yet it's not. Well, part of Kant's point here is to contrast aesthetic and rational ideals and ideas. It's clear that he sees the role of the aesthetic ideas as mediating between the rational ideas on the one hand and sensibility and imagination on the other. And of course, he thinks that rational consciousness wins. Kant, second frame here in judgment, the former of these. So this is where we break down into the subjective. We judge by taste. Taste is very subjective. And aesthetically by the medium of the feeling of pleasure. The latter, objectivity, by understanding and reason, logically according to concepts. So in the critique of judgment, we get very clearly that that subjective stuff, that intuition, we're not going to mess with that. We're going to deal with reason. By the 18th century, we've got aesthetics as reason pretty much determined. And we've entered into the philosophical lexicon. The term aesthetic has come to designate, among other things, a kind of object, a kind of judgment, a kind of attitude, a kind of experience, and a kind of value. So you see there judgment, but a preconceptual judgment, an attitude, a kind of experience, a kind of value. And the times are changing. With Kant, aesthetics went with the mode of the era, the mental duality, rationalism, and the subjective. But one thing on the side is I got more strict here because aesthetic is being used very broadly anymore. I saw a political aesthetic, and then I saw a military aesthetic, and that was it. So the modern era then comes in with rationalism about beauty, is the view that judgments of beauty are judgments of reason, that we judge things to be beautiful by reasoning it out. where reasoning it out typically involves inferring from principles or applying concepts. And so these then overlap with logic and rationality. That misses the intuitive, the tasteful, the preconceptual. Kant opens the notion of the judgment of the intuitive, but the experience is not just reason-bound. And Kant's truth is not Gebser's truth. Gebser's truth is an awareing of truth. So here's an interesting one. Makunis-san Nietzsche, ushering in the integral. Makunis said at the second Gebser conference at Ohio University that Nietzsche ushered in the integral consciousness. Now, it was very interesting. I have this paper. I think I got it at the time, and I have it digitally. I edited a lot of Makunis's work for a period of time. It was not in the paper. I think the paper on Nietzsche was for another presentation. But orally, I remember very clearly Makunis saying that Nietzsche ushered in the integral consciousness. Nietzsche was reevaluated. He reevaluated the whole of Western civilization and revalued values, morality, and returned to an aesthetic life, a life that is constructive, lived as a free spirit, and not following the herd. And I just read a book recently that might come up too later, Hiking with Nietzsche. In the end of the book, the author who has hiked in the Swiss mountains with where Nietzsche had hiked, found himself in the last chapter amongst the herd of sheep who were coming down from the mountains from feeding over the summer and were going into the barn for the winter. And here he was in the midst of the sheep in the herd and couldn't do a damn thing about it. So we're looking at, with the integral, we're looking at a reevaluation of all of Western civilization, and actually much more than that. Other civilizations are tied to ours too, or we're tied to theirs. But basically, it's a revaluing of everything that we've done, and the integral will do that work. So Nietzsche introduced aperspectivity, where we consider all the perspectives, as in morality, as he did with reevaluating all morality, and then realizing that you are in a place of wholeness that is more than any perspective, and all is integrating. There is a place that allows you to see the perspectives and more. So where are you at that you can see all the perspectives? But I think this is a discipline that Gebser would say we have to cultivate. A field that is free of mental limits is what he says, before we can get to the integral and be in this open field of many perspectives, but so much more as background and field of understanding. So Nietzsche's aesthetic life and Gebser's daily life. One divergence in the history of aesthetics was Nietzsche, who found significance in an aesthetic life. And this was inspired by the Greeks. He was a brilliant Greek scholar. What do we call it? A linguistic scholar. So inspired by the Greeks, he sought to live in beauty, transforming agony and drudgery into something creative and enrapturing. And that phrase was from Hiking with Nietzsche, which is a book that just came out recently. And he sought generally a constructive way of living with the eternal return. And that's something that needs explaining. People often don't understand what the eternal return is, and it's related to his constructive way of living. And the eternal return is when you make a decision. Can you live with that decision if you had to live through the same times with the same decision over and over and over and over again? So can you live with that eternal return of the same? If you can, then I think you're living a life of truth, right? Of awareing of truth, because you see the gravity of any situation that you might be in. And I'm stretching time now. For Gebser, it's the aesthetic of daily life, and this comes up in a short chapter, I think second or third from the end. And it is about the new consciousness that will not be fully valid so long as it is not lived in daily life. So like Nietzsche, or like the Greeks really, we must live a full life if we are to realize the aesthetic of the awareing of truth. And another interesting sidelight here is Alfonso Lingus, who was like a brother to Alvin Aquinas, was coming to our conferences for many years, and he had a famous saying that it altered the Greek. The Greek said, the unexamined life, the unexamined life is not worth living. And he turned it around and he said, the unlived life is not worth examining. So we will not be fully valid so long as we have not lived in daily life. And further, as Gebser says, it will happen of its own accord, and each individual's attitude and mode of behavior can ensure its process of success. We see this over and over again in Gebser, is that we have a responsibility, that the integral is coming, but we have to take part. We have to be part of the major plan of the whole thing. Otherwise, I think he would say we won't ensure the success of the process. So everyone can achieve the whole with the awareing of origin, and that's what he talks about too when he talks about the awareing of truth or living in truth. And this includes the supersession of the ego and the realizing of time freedom. And I think that's a tough one in our temporal society. And I know we all grapple with that. How do we deal with the chronic anxiety that comes with temporality and the concreteness of temporality? One thing I discovered this last year or so was an extension of my paper that I've delivered on time. And I found a section that talked about phenomenology and Husserl's concerns about time. And he said in this statement that I had never heard before, that at the absolute level, the origin, right, the archaic, that there was no absolute time, that time didn't have a total or even a partial footnote. It could resonate there, but so we see that time doesn't have to dominate or be critical. So Gebser says aesthetic is truth, the first one. For Gebser, truth is aesthetic or awareing of truth. What is concrete is what is perceptible. This is what he would say, or we would say too, about the aesthetic. Because of an intensified consciousness, we need to deal with the concrete. In the invisible origin, he also confirms that this perceiving, Wahrnehmen, is how the integral consciousness realizes what is made present. Presentiating the whole is permeated by the spiritual and by the transparent. And these are interesting terms to work with, presentiating the whole, permeated by the spirit and the transparent. And of course, we don't get to that unless we do our work and live the daily life. So this means not following a mass phenomenon, the herd, or mental rational deficiency, that is, an equilibrium from which life can sustain itself. We wear the whole, and the whole wears us. And this, at last, sounds like Nietzsche too. You know Nietzsche. We stare into the abyss, and eventually the abyss stares back at us. So, second one here, Gebser is indirect in what he considers the integral aesthetic, but this sentence is as clear as it gets. Eighth perspectivity, or the integrality, is the volition, the a-wearing and truth of the whole, and consequently of its spiritual manifestations, the diaphanon, inasmuch as the whole is perceptible only as transparency within origin, and also containing the entire future as time-free present. So, what's there? Eighth perspectivity is what the integrality is about, the integrating consciousness, is the volition, the a-wearing of truth of the whole, and consequently of its spiritual manifestation. And that one comes up again and again, the spiritual manifestation. And I think he's dealing with a Christian emphasis there. The diaphanon, in as much as the whole is perceptible, the diaphanon and the transparency within origin, seeing through, envisioning, as Mukunda said a couple of years ago when we had him on to talk about the integral consciousness, and also containing the entire future as time-free present. And this ties us back to Nietzsche. If you look in the ever-present origin, there's a footnote saying that Nietzsche was the first one to include future in the time-free present. So as achieved by breaking free of the mental conceptualization, that's really what we need to deal with. And finally, maybe the last part of this, but I'll do a little bit more, is a very interesting quote by Picasso, but I also found it, the origin in Hesse, Hermann Hesse, and Steppenwolf, I think it was. So Picasso was saying, they call me a seeker. I am not seeking, I am finding. And I think that's part of the truth here too, is that it's not about the will. And even for Nietzsche, the will to power is the way that Nietzsche, and not just Nietzsche, but society in general works. Society in general works around the will, but for him, the will was this finding in experience, in the everyday, what needed to be transformed and worked with. So aesthetics is receptivity. Gebser and the manifestation of the integral consciousness shows us how the integral is indexed in science, architecture, poetry, literature, art. The transformation is clear and includes daily life, though not complete. Mutations are multi-millennial phenomena. And there is another aspect of the aesthetic, how we process what we perceive, how we process what we perceive. More than feelings is perception, and that our perception is always working within the flesh of the world, with Merleau-Ponty. We are in and of, that shouldn't be off, it should be of. We are in and of the world that we perceive, and we live on a daily basis, engrossed and fleshed in the world. So this is where maybe I'll finish up. I guess I got 5 more minutes. We'll go a little bit more here. So Merleau-Ponty, one of his basic themes is institutions that shape perception, and institutions of language, society, government, etc. Are structures of consciousness structures. I'm getting messed up here, but much more general. But there's no such thing as we were saying earlier, a settled law or evolution to a democracy. Life is always atemporal, presencing, as Gebser would describe it. In the book I mentioned yesterday, The Dawn of Everything, civilizations, societies are in flux, changing, taking on many forms, many different formations. Gebser would say constellations, and unrolling and rolling up again. That's the root of evolving, evolution, spreading, saturating, and then dispersing. And in the dawn of everything, we see how fluxated civilizations are. They fall apart, they come back together, they fall apart, come back together in a different manner as an authoritarian structure. So many things happen. So finally, integral consciousness must be lived every day, but we may be dithering, not realizing the border, the critical saturation of integrality. The full effectuality of the integrating may be fluctuating for a long time. So I think we'll stop there. Is that okay? Can you hear me?
Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
that's
okay.
great.
You have about
Great.
4.5 minutes
Hey,
left, Mike.
David. Okay, yeah, that's if you want to say something else, you can, but if you're complete, that's fine too. It was beautiful. Would you like?
From where we just to say where we go from here, and that is to deal with the other aspects of aesthetics. I didn't mention enough, maybe I'll just say one thing, that Gebser always is looking at manifestations as integral or indexing, as Al Mukundis would sometimes say, indexing the structure of consciousness or the structures of consciousness. So he begins that in his book on grammar, where he shows grammar as the first indication that we're in a shifted consciousness. And then later, and many other ways through art, through architecture, and so forth, he deals with this, the things that manifest, right, the new consciousness. So that's where the rest of the paper will be going into art as aesthetic, and how art indicates that there's a civilizational shift of consciousness happening, or maybe even just a shift in consciousness, and we don't even have to call it civilizational, because it permeates all of the modes of consciousness, as Sri Aurobindo would say. I just finished this summer the Life Divine, all 1100, and there's a lot of resonance there with Gebser. So that'll be good.